Clara Moss had buried her illusions at 12, the same year she buried her mother, and she had not missed either of them since. She was 27 now, spare and quiet, with steady hands and eyes that did not flinch from what other eyes refused to see. It was this quality that had made her indispensable to the households of the county whenever death required a capable and silent attendant. She did not mourn the women she prepared. She did not pretend to. She arrived, she worked, she departed, and she left behind only the quiet evidence of her care. Linen smoothed without a wrinkle, hair arranged with respectful precision, hands folded as though they had only just come to rest. She had learned early that being good at an invisible thing was the surest way to survive. Clara Moss dressed the dead, and the dead kept her fed. Greyvale Court had sent for her at first light. The Countess Ashvale had passed in the night. Would Miss Moss attend the laying out? It was phrased as a question, but intended as a summons, and Clara had understood the difference since girlhood. She had packed her case, pinned her plain dark wool against the November cold, and hired a carrier's cart out along the rutted eastern road, through fields the iron rain had stripped to grey. Greyvale itself emerged from the fog like a statement of ownership, vast, pale, and indifferent to the smallness of those who approached it. Clara had known houses like this. She had known them to swallow a woman whole and return only her silence. She straightened her back and knocked at the servants' entrance with 3 precise strikes. The steward was a man called Price. She learned his name from the under-footman who showed her the way, a young man who spoke it with a slight lowering of the voice, as one speaks the name of a creditor. Price was waiting at the entrance to the undercroft, a single lamp in his hand, his face arranged into an expression that disclosed nothing. He was perhaps 50, with the posture of a man who had stood at attention so long he had forgotten there was any other way to stand. He looked at Clara, assessed her, and appeared to find her adequate. He did not offer a greeting. He held out a length of fine black silk. "The veil," he said. "It is to be laid over the face before the household assembles to pay their respects at 9 o'clock. The Countess is not to be uncovered before that hour. Is that understood?" It was not a question either. "Perfectly," Clara said. She accepted the veil. The silk was heavy and very fine, the kind of cloth that costs more than she earned in a quarter. "You were shown the identification miniature," he said, "when the household solicitor's man attended yesterday. You remember the likeness?" "I do," she said. He studied her a moment longer, as though deciding whether she was the sort of woman who told the truth. He must have concluded that she was, because he turned without another word and left her alone with the lamp, the veil, and the dead. The undercroft was cold in the way that old stone is cold, not the cold of a night that will pass, but the cold of centuries, settled and permanent. A long oak table stood at the centre of the room. Upon it lay the woman who had been the Countess Ashvale, arranged in her burial dress, her arms at her sides. She looked small in the formal gown, smaller than Clara had expected from the miniature. Clara set down her case, moved to the table and examined the linen at the Countess's collar, which had bunched slightly along one side. She would smooth it. That was what she had come to do. She reached for the veil to draw it aside, just enough to work at the throat, and as she lifted the silk, her hand stilled. She did not move for a long moment. She stood in the cold, underground room with a lamp burning steadily and the iron rain speaking against the stones above, and she looked at the face of the woman on the table. It was not the face in the miniature. The woman in the miniature had been smooth-browed, serene, unmarked by accident or violence. The woman on the table had a scar above her left brow, a thin, pale crescent, healed long ago, the kind of mark left by a fall in childhood or a careless encounter with a low branch in the dark, small, permanent, entirely absent from the portrait she had been shown for identification. Clara lowered the veil. She smoothed the linen at the collar, which was what she had come to do. She folded her hands and stood quietly in the lamplight, and she said nothing at all. The cold room kept its silence around her, and she kept hers, and the question between them, small, pale, and shaped like a crescent scar, settled in like winter, unhurried and prepared to stay. The carriage came through the iron rain just as the last light left the sky above Greyvale Court. It moved slowly, as though the horses themselves were reluctant to arrive. The wheels found the gravel drive and crunched to a halt before the great stone portico, and for a long moment nothing stirred within the vehicle at all. Then the door opened, and Edward Ashvale, Earl of Greyvale, stepped down into the wet dark alone. He was 35 years of age, and he moved like a man who had learned, very early, the cost of arriving anywhere too eagerly. His coat was plain and dark, his hat pulled low against the rain. He stood a moment in the downpour, one hand resting on the carriage door, and looked up at the face of the house the way a man might look at a wound he has grown accustomed to carrying. Greyvale Court looked back at him without welcome. Every curtain in the upper floors had been drawn closed, giving the facade the appearance of a house that had shut its eyes. A single lamp burned in the entrance hall, visible through the narrow glass beside the door, casting thin yellow light no further than the top step. The house breathed cold air from every crack and threshold, as though the walls were exhaling something long held in. Mrs. Dent was waiting just inside. She curtsied as his lordship crossed the threshold. "My lord, the household is assembled in the east drawing-room. Should you wish to receive condolences this evening? If not, I have had the study prepared." "The study," he said, without hesitation. He gave his hat and gloves to the footman and walked without pausing into the corridor beyond. Mrs. Dent followed, her voice low in the way one speaks in a house of recent death. "The arrangements have proceeded as expected, my lord. Mr. Fenwick attended this afternoon regarding the interment schedule, and a temporary attendant has been engaged for the laying out, a Miss Moss. She came with a recommendation and has been perfectly quiet throughout." His lordship said nothing. He passed the door of the east drawing-room, from behind which came the muffled sound of subdued voices. He did not slow his pace. He had long since perfected the art of moving through a room's periphery, as though it were a foreign country he had no wish to enter. The corridors had a character of their own at this hour, not a sudden cold, but a gradual one, a chill that accumulated as you moved deeper into the house. The clocks stood at whatever hour they had been stopped, their faces sealed beneath squares of black fabric. The air smelled of beeswax and cold stone and something older, the particular stillness of a house where grief has been performed so long it has become indistinguishable from habit. Edward Ashvale had first come to understand that quality of grief 7 years prior, when his first Countess had been brought home from a riding accident on a grey November morning and had not spoken again before the end. He had stood at her bedside with his hands very still at his sides, and he had learned then that the body has its own response to the unbearable, which is to become very quiet and very deliberate, to take one step and then another, to find the most useful thing within reach and attend to it. He had carried that lesson ever since, visible in the measured pace, the low and even voice, the way he listened without appearing to wait. He was courteous to everyone in his household and intimate with no one. The staff respected him and did not entirely understand him, which suited him well enough. He was crossing the back staircase landing when he stopped. A young woman stood at the turn of the stair, her back pressed gently to the wall to allow him room to pass. She wore plain wool, dark and unadorned, with a small cloth cap set back from her face. She was not a housemaid. Her bearing was too composed for that. She had the look of someone accustomed to making herself as small as the available space required. She did not speak. She did not look away either. For one unguarded moment Edward Ashvale looked directly at her. Not the glancing acknowledgement one offered a servant in a corridor, but a true look, the kind that arrives before the customary distance can be reassembled. Her eyes were steady and quite grey, and they held no performance in them at all. No performed sorrow, no careful arrangement of expression, only a kind of watchful quiet that he recognized distantly as something akin to his own. Then he continued up the stair, without a word. Behind him the house settled back into its silence. The rain moved against the high windows in soft, irregular intervals. Somewhere deep in the east wing, a clock that had not been properly sealed resumed its ticking for a moment, then stopped again, as though it too had thought better of the hour. The candles in the undercroft burned low and still. The air smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Clara Moss worked, without haste. She had learned that the dead deserve the same quiet attention one would give the living. She was smoothing the linen across the woman's shoulder when she saw it. The left wrist lay turned slightly toward the light, and the skin there, pale as new milk, carried a faint marking. Clara leaned closer. She looked the way one looks at a thing one is not certain one has seen correctly. It did not resolve. The initials were inked in a fine, faded hand. M.R., 2 letters only, placed just below the inner wrist, where a glove's edge would conceal them in company. The ink had aged to the colour of a bruise. Clara straightened slowly and said nothing. E.A. Those were the initials that belonged here. Eleanor Ashvale, Countess of Greyvale, née Fairstone, married 12 years, dead these 3 days of a fever that came on sudden in the night. That was the story the household told. That was the story Clara had been given when she arrived 2 mornings past, summoned to perform the office that required a steady nerve and a closed mouth. M.R. was not E.A. She finished her work. She straightened the linen, folded the hands, set everything as it ought to be. She did not allow her face to change. She had lived long enough in other people's houses to understand that what a woman shows is what a woman can be held to. Mrs. Dent came at 10:30 to inspect the laying out. She was a small woman, iron-haired, with eyes that had the quality of latched shutters. "Everything in order?" she asked. "Yes, Mrs. Dent." Clara smoothed an invisible crease in the shroud. "I wondered only—" She paused, as though the thought were incidental. Whether her ladyship was ever known by a name other than Eleanor, a family pet name perhaps, or a name from before her marriage, it can be useful to know, for the record book. The silence that followed was a particular kind, not the silence of someone who does not know the answer, the silence of someone who has decided not to give it. "Her name was Eleanor," said Mrs. Dent. "Lady Greyvale, that is all that need concern you." "Of course," said Clara. "Forgive me." Mrs. Dent's gaze moved over the room, each candle, each fold of linen, the hands, the closed eyes. She nodded once and went away. Clara stood alone again with the candles and the cold. She began, in the careful back rooms of her mind, to understand the shape of what she had stumbled into. Not an error, not a confusion of records. The face beneath the veil was not the face in the miniature. The initials on the wrist did not belong to the woman the household mourned. A substitution, that was the word, and once it came it would not leave. Someone lay in this coffin who was not the Countess of Greyvale, and the household intended her to stay there. Clara was tucking the edge of the linen when her fingers met something small and stiff inside the chemise, near the breast. She drew it out, a violet, pressed flat, dry, the colour faded to brownish purple, but the shape still perfect, 5 petals, stem intact. There was a faint fragrance still, barely there, like the memory of a garden. She knew her wild flowers. Her mother had taught her, walking the lanes of Shropshire. This was not a violet that grew in Yorkshire. This flower had come from somewhere south, or from a glass house, or from a hand that carried it a long distance for reasons of its own. She replaced it and told herself she had not seen it. She was crossing the corridor toward the back stair when she nearly walked into Thomas, the young under-footman, coming the other way with a pair of unlit candelabra. He was perhaps 19, with an honest, uneasy face. "Beg pardon, miss." He stepped aside. Then, because he had not yet learned to keep uncomfortable things to himself, he said, "Did you find her, that is, was everything as it should be?" "Everything was in order," Clara said. "Only," he said, almost quietly, "she looked different at the end. I'd seen her ladyship at the drive 3 weeks past, when she came down to meet the carriage, and she looked—" He stopped. "Grief changes a face, I suppose?" Clara looked at him. He was not suspicious. He was only a young man reaching for the most comfortable explanation available. "Yes," she said gently. "I suppose it does." She left him in the corridor and climbed the back stair alone. Somewhere beyond the baize door, the household went on with its grief. Clara carried hers differently. Not grief, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The weight of a thing known and not yet spoken. The particular loneliness of a question one has no safe place to ask. The clock on the landing had long since struck 2 when Edward Ashvale descended to the library. The hall sconces had been left burning low, as they always were in houses that had once known a mistress and had not yet forgotten the habit. He had not slept. This was not unusual. Sleep, in the months since the funeral, had become a courtesy he could not rely upon. It came when it chose and departed without apology. He had learned to fill the hours with reading, with the particular silence of a house that holds its breath around a man it does not quite know how to comfort. The library door stood a half-inch open. A line of amber light lay across the corridor floor. The lamp on the reading table had been recently trimmed. The flame burned clean and steady, without the guttering that had plagued it for the past week. He had noticed it and thought to mention it to someone. Evidently, someone had attended to it without being told. Clara Moss stood beside the lamp table with the spent brass trimmer still in her hand. She had not heard him at the door. She was looking at the shelves along the far wall. Her gaze moved across the spines with unhurried, precise attention, as though she were memorizing the titles without permitting herself the indulgence of reaching for any of them. She wore a plain dark wrapper over her dress, and her hair was simply braided. She looked less like a woman employed in service and more like someone who had always belonged to rooms full of books. Edward stepped into the room. She turned at once. The composure on her face held, but only just. A faint colour came into her cheeks, not quite embarrassment, not quite alarm, something more precise than either. "My lord." She lowered the trimmer to the table and moved toward the door. "Forgive me. I did not expect the room to be in use. I will leave you to it." "You need not leave." The words came out flat, as most things did when he spoke them. He did not mean them as an invitation precisely. He meant them as a statement of fact, in the manner of a man who finds social fiction more exhausting than honesty. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment, assessing whether the remark had been genuine or merely polite. She seemed to conclude it had been genuine. She did not leave. He crossed to the chair nearest the fire and took up the book he had come down to find. He turned to his page. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Silence in this house had acquired a pressurized quality since the funeral, as though always on the verge of collapsing into something worse. This silence was different. It simply sat. It occupied the room without apology and without demand. He became aware of the steadiness of her hands as she set the lamp things to rights. She placed each small object back with care that was neither anxious nor performative, but simply exact. The brass trimmer, the small cloth, the tin of lamp oil, its lid replaced with a soft click. Then she did not leave. She moved instead to the far shelf and stood before it. Her eyes moved along the titles. Her hands remained at her sides. She did not reach for a volume. She read the spines as a person reads a letter they may look at but not keep, with attention and with a careful self-denial that had become, through long practice, almost indistinguishable from preference. He said, without fully intending to say anything at all, "Do you find the house cold, Miss Moss?" She turned her head, not startled, but attentive. She considered the question with an honesty that most people reserved for much closer acquaintance. "I find it waiting, my lord," she said. He looked up from his page. "Waiting for what?" She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She was never evasive. He was beginning to understand, but careful, in the manner of a woman who has learned to be sure of a thing before she says it aloud. "For permission to be itself again, my lord," she said. He did not reply. He held her answer in the silence and turned it over. The fire settled once more, a soft collapse of ash. Outside, the night pressed cold against the library windows, and somewhere in the east wing a shutter knocked once and was quiet. Edward Ashvale looked back at his book. He did not read. Miss Moss remained a little longer beside the shelf, her gaze resting, very quietly, somewhere in the middle distance. Then she made a small, composed curtsy, to the room rather than to him, or perhaps to both, for they had come to occupy the same silence, and slipped out through the half-open door without another word. The library held the shape of her absence the way a room holds warmth after a candle has been carried out, gradually, and then not at all. The east wing of Greyvale Court held its breath in a particular way. Not the held breath of anticipation, but the held breath of something sealed, rooms that had not been disturbed in the week since the Countess was carried out of them, and did not intend to be disturbed now. Clara Moss walked the corridor with a small brass lamp and a ledger tucked under her arm, and the floorboards announced every step. Mrs. Dent had given her the instructions herself, standing at the foot of the servants' stair, with her keys gathered at her waist. The late Countess's personal effects are to be catalogued and removed, she had said, her voice carrying the flatness of a woman who has decided that feeling nothing is a form of loyalty. The Earl wishes the rooms cleared before the month is out. And the correspondence box, Clara had asked, for she had noticed it on her previous visit, a lacquered thing, small and dark, sitting on the writing table as though waiting to be asked about. Mrs. Dent had paused. It was not a long pause, but it was the kind that contains a great deal. "The letters inside are to be burned unread," she said. She produced a small iron key from the innermost ring and held it out, and her eyes, when Clara took it, said something that her mouth did not. Clara carried the box to the window, where the grey morning light fell thin and honest. She opened it. The letters inside were tied with a length of ribbon the colour of dried lavender. There were perhaps 11 or 12 of them. She untied the ribbon and sorted through them, careful not to disturb the order. Most were in the hand she had come to recognise from the household accounts, a loose, educated script leaning to the right. These she set aside, but at the very bottom of the pile, beneath a folded mourning card and a dried sprig of something she could not identify, lay a letter in a different hand entirely. Smaller, more deliberate, the quality of a person who had learned to write carefully because they could not afford to waste paper. Clara read it once, then she read it again. The letter bore no salutation that named either party. It began mid-thought, as letters do between people who have long since dispensed with pleasantries. "The arrangement that saved us both," it read, "must now be allowed to rest. You have kept your part with a fidelity I never dared require of you, and I have kept mine. What passed between us in the spring of that year need trouble neither of us further. You may live as you have lived. I have made my peace with what I am." It was signed with 2 initials only. M.R. Clara stood at the window for a long moment. Outside, a rook settled on the stone ledge and regarded her with the indifference of a creature that has witnessed many things and found none of them surprising. She thought of the face beneath the veil. She thought of the scar. She thought of the pressed violet she had found folded into the household accounts, and of the way Mrs. Dent's pause had occupied a space larger than itself. A woman of lesser rank, a woman who resembled the Countess closely enough that in extremity, in grief or fear, or whatever darkness had required the arrangement, she might have stood in for her, might have lived in her place, or died in it. The thought arrived not as a shock, but as a key turning in a lock already loosened by several careful weeks of small, patient observations. If the woman laid out in the Countess's chamber with the Countess's rings upon her hands was not in truth the Countess, then the Countess herself might yet be somewhere, hidden, protected, perhaps not by her own choosing. Clara breathed out slowly. She gathered the ribbon and retied the letters, all but one. The remaining 11 she carried to the iron grate at the far end of the room, where a fire had been laid but not yet lit. She lit it herself and fed the letters in one by one, watching each page receive the light before releasing it into ash and air. The single letter she folded very precisely along its original creases. Then once more, she lifted the hem of her apron and tucked the folded page into the inner seam where she had once kept a needle case on a long journey. She picked up her ledger. She noted the correspondence box, emptied and catalogued. She noted 11 letters of a personal nature, destroyed per instruction. She did not note the 12th. Greyvale Court settled around her as she closed the door, the old wood contracting in the chill with a sound like a single whispered word. Clara walked the corridor back toward the servants' stair, her lamp steady, her step unhurried, and something small and consequential pressed close against her side. The house, she thought, was still waiting. Only now, so was she. The candle in the undercroft had burned low enough that its flame no longer cast proper shadows, only a pale, trembling wash across the stone floor and the white linen of the bier. Clara Moss sat beside it on a 3-legged stool, her hands folded in her lap, her back very straight. She was not weeping. She was not praying, not with her eyes closed and her lips moving over memorized words. She was simply present, the way a woman is present who has sat with the dying before and learned that silence is not the same as absence. She had been there nearly an hour when she began to speak. It was the low, unhurried address of one woman to another, the kind that requires no answer and expects none, spoken only when one is certain of not being overheard. "You were afraid of something," Clara said. Her voice did not echo. The undercroft absorbed it, the way very old stone absorbs everything, slowly, without judgment. "I do not know yet what it was, but I think you knew it was coming. I think you arranged for it as best you could." She paused. The candle shifted in a draught from nowhere she could identify. "I kept the letter," she said quietly. "I should not have done, but I did not think it wise to leave it where Mrs. Dent might find it. You will forgive me, I hope. I believe you would." There was only the cold and the candle and the still white linen and the words that seemed to need saying, and so were said. At the top of the undercroft stairs, on the other side of the half-open door, Edward Ashvale, Earl of Greyvale, stood without moving. He had come down for no reason he could have named. He had stood in his study for an hour after the household retired, turning a small carved paperweight in his fingers, alabaster, a gift he had never thanked the giver for, and eventually set it down and walked. He had not intended to approach the undercroft. The door was ajar. The candlelight was visible from the foot of the stairs as a thin gold line along the floor. He heard, before he saw anything, the particular quality of the silence, not empty, but inhabited, and then a voice so quiet it took him a moment to be certain he was hearing it at all. He looked through the gap in the door. He saw Clara Moss on her stool, her profile steady as a figure cut from paper, her hands entirely still. He could not hear the words from here, only the cadence, unhurried, unperforming, the cadence of genuine address. He did not enter. He stood long enough to understand what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was grief that was not hers, tended with a care that had not been asked of her, and was being offered anyway, in the cold, in the dark. Everything else in this house was performing. The flowers on the hall table were performing. The black crape at the windows was performing. His own face, when he allowed it to be seen, was performing, arranging itself into appropriate gravity, appropriate distance. He had not realized, until this moment, that there was nothing to compare it against. There was something to compare it against now. He withdrew before she turned, and went back up the stairs without sound. In the morning, he sent word through the house steward. The woman sitting vigil was to receive an additional half-crown for her diligence. Mrs. Dent brought the coin to Clara in the passage outside the linen room, holding it on a small silver salver. "His lordship," she said, "has seen fit to recognize your attendance." Clara looked at the coin. She did not reach for it immediately. That was not necessary. "No," said Mrs. Dent, "it was not." She held the salver steady. "His lordship is not accustomed to noticing the help." "I did not ask to be noticed," Clara said. She took the coin then. It was warm, as coins carried inside a house always were, which struck her as a strange intimacy. Mrs. Dent regarded her for a long moment. The passage was narrow. The morning light from the single high window fell between them like a dividing line drawn in pale chalk. "No," Mrs. Dent said at last, her voice carrying something that was not quite sourness and not quite respect. "That is precisely what he noticed." She withdrew with the salver. Clara stood in the passage alone, the half-crown in her closed hand. She had not asked to be seen. She had not arranged herself for it. And yet the coin was real and warm, and the Earl had stood somewhere in this house and made a decision, and she could not unknow that. She held very still, the way one holds still when something has changed and one is not yet certain what it means. And she waited for the stillness to tell her. The violet had a name, though Clara had not known it until that morning. She found it in a slim botanical volume on the lowest shelf of the servants' hall, its pages brown at the corners. The illustration matched exactly the pale lilac petals, the narrowing of the leaf, the faint darkening at the throat of the bloom. It was called Viola doweriana, given by a botanist long dead to a variety that grew in very few places in England. One of those places was footnoted, Greyvale in the county of. The page was torn, but it was enough. Clara pressed her finger to the name and held very still. The violet had not come from a hedgerow or a market stall. It had come from this estate, from the walled garden of the dower house, the one the late Countess had loved before she died, before she was said to have died. Clara closed the book and set it back in its place. She asked Mrs. Holt for leave to take the air after luncheon. Her head ached, which was true enough. The housekeeper looked at her a moment too long, then nodded and said to be back before the cold turned sharp. Clara thanked her and went out through the kitchen passage. The grounds lay grey and still under a thin winter sky. She walked the long way around, past the kitchen garden and the empty stable yard, through the stand of bare elms, until the stone wall of the dower house came into view. It was low and square, half smothered in dead ivy, with one chimney at its near end. A warped shutter hung at an angle from the single ground-floor window facing east. The gate in the wall was fastened with a padlock, new, the metal unstained by rust. She did not try the gate. She walked along the wall's outer face, her boots quiet on the frozen grass, until she reached the corner where the shutter hung from its single remaining hinge. Through the gap she could see a slice of the interior, flagstones, a hearth, and in the hearth a fire. A low fire banked and settled, but burning. Orange light moved against the far wall. Her breath stopped. She pressed closer. On the wing-back chair nearest the fire lay a shawl. Dark wool, thrown there as one throws a shawl when one means to return. It was not dusty. It lay with the soft weight of something recently worn, its fringe curled toward the warmth. Worked across its centre in silk thread of deep blue was a cipher, 2 letters, intertwined, a C and an M. The Countess's monogram in the style Clara had already seen on a linen cuff tucked inside the death chest. CM, not EA, the initials of the woman who had signed the letter, MR. Or perhaps the cipher was reversed, was RM, and the shawl belonged to her, the woman of the walled garden. Clara stepped back from the wall. The cold moved through her wool cape as though the fabric were muslin. She looked once more at the chimney. Smoke rose, thin and steady. Someone had laid that fire. The house was not empty. She walked back at an even pace. She passed through the elm stand and the kitchen yard and climbed the servants' stair without meeting anyone who looked at her closely. In her small room she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and did not move for a quarter of an hour. The Countess was alive. The body in the house had belonged to another woman, the MR of the letter perhaps, or some third soul drawn into the arrangement. The cipher on the shawl was not dusty. The fire was burning. These were not shadows or inference, they were facts as solid as the stone of the dower house wall. What she could not yet read was Edward. Whether he sat in his study carrying grief for a wife who breathed and walked and stirred her own fire not a quarter-mile from his window. Whether he was deceived, whether he was grieving an absence that was also a choice, his or hers, or both. The letter had said, the arrangement that saved us both. 2 people, saving each other. That was not the language of death. She smoothed her apron and rose. She went up the back stair to the corridor outside his study and stood at the door until her voice would be even. Then she knocked. He said, "Come." She opened the door and stepped to the threshold. "My lord," she said, "forgive the interruption. I wonder if I might speak with you privately about a matter concerning the estate." He had been standing at the window with his back to her. He turned. He looked at her face in the way a man looks when he has been expecting something and does not yet know its shape. A long moment passed. The fire in the study ticked. "You have found something," he said. It was not a question. The fire had burned low by the time the door closed. Clara stood near the window, her hands folded, the cold of the glass reaching her through the curtain's edge. Edward Ashvale moved to his desk, but did not sit. He rested one hand upon its surface, as a man rests upon something solid when the ground has shifted. The candles threw long shadows across the shelves and the rows of bound ledgers. He seemed, in that moment, very alone. Clara waited without pressing, without retreating. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. He spoke at last, without looking at her. He said that Marguerite had not come to him in the ordinary way of things. There had been no courtship, no letters pressed between pages. There had been an arrangement. His family had known her family, and what passed between those parties had been a transaction as plainly as any in a merchant's ledger, though conducted with the language of propriety laid carefully over it. He said the word arrangement without bitterness. He said it the way a man names a condition he has long since ceased to rail against. 3 months into the marriage, he said, he had learned something. It had come to him the way truths sometimes arrive, sideways, through a letter not addressed to him but left where he would find it. He discovered that Marguerite had been promised before to a man whose name Edward did not speak and whose character he described only as dangerous. She had not come to Greyvale freely. She had come because his name, his title, the simple fact of the Earl's household placed her beyond the reach of what had been arranged for her elsewhere. She had been fleeing, and he had, without knowing it, been a door she could close behind her. He could have annulled the marriage. The arrangement had given him grounds enough. He had not wished to use them. What he offered instead was his name without condition. He asked nothing of her, not warmth, not the performance of a match neither had chosen with the heart. He moved toward the fire and stood with his back to Clara, one arm resting on the mantelpiece. She had accepted this with a dignity he had come to admire, he said, and had not admitted to himself until much later. Clara watched his profile in the firelight, the set of his shoulder, the stillness of him, a man who has carried something heavy so long he no longer notices the weight, only its absence when it lifts. She thought of the dower house, the lit fire behind the shutter, the ciphered shawl folded on the chair. She thought of MR in careful thread and the pressed violet in the forbidden letter. She held all of it inside her and did not speak. He was told she died in childbed. He said this plainly, and Clara heard in the plainness of it the shape of old grief, smoothed by years into something that no longer cut, but had not wholly healed. He had been in the north on estate business when word came. By the time he returned, there was nothing left to return to. He grieved, he said, not precisely a wife, they had not been that to one another, but a person whose steadiness had surprised him. And then he paused, and Clara heard the word before he spoke it. The child. He had been told the child was lost with her. That grief had been the sharper one, because in those last weeks before the journey north, he had begun to hope. Clara looked at him and understood. The understanding arrived not as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. He did not know. He was not complicit in whatever had been arranged in the dower house at the edge of the grounds. He was the last person who had been meant to know. His was the grief of a man told a lie so cleanly that he had never found the seam of it. She said, before she could prevent herself, "Did you love her?" The question sat between them. She heard it as he must have, too close, too direct. The kind of question that has no safe place between an earl and a lady's attendant, however late the hour. She said quickly, "Forgive me, that is not—" He interrupted her, quietly, in the way a man interrupts to spare someone the difficulty of an unfinished sentence. He said, "I did not, but I would have, given time." The fire shifted. A log settled with a soft collapse of embers, and the room grew a degree warmer and a degree darker at once. Outside, the grounds lay still beneath their covering of cloud. The dower house waited somewhere in that darkness, its fire burning, its silence intact, its secret outlasting grief and season and the turning of several careful years. Clara stood in the candlelight and said nothing more. She only held what she now knew, close and quiet, as one holds a flame cupped against the wind. The last light of evening came slowly to Greyvale. Clara walked beside Edward along the path that wound behind the gardens, through the stand of birch trees where the leaves were beginning to silver and curl. Neither of them spoke. The dower house sat at the far edge of the grounds, half hidden by ivy, its windows dark except for one. In that single window a lamp burned low and steady. Edward noticed it first. He slowed his step and looked, and Clara saw something move across his face, not surprise, but the exhaustion of a man who has feared the truth and is now, at last, walking toward it. They reached the door. Edward raised his hand to knock. Before his knuckles met the wood, the door opened. Marguerite had been watching from the window. She stood in the doorway without speaking, one hand resting on the door frame. She was thinner than her portrait. Her dark hair was drawn back plainly, without ornament, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been placed there by illness alone. She wore a grey dress, the sort a woman wears when she has ceased to think about being observed. In the crook of her other arm, wrapped in a pale blanket, lay a child of perhaps 5 or 6 months. The child was asleep, its small face turned against Marguerite's shoulder. A daughter. Clara understood this in an instant, and stood very still. Edward understood it too. He looked at the child and said nothing for a long moment. The fire inside cast a warm, unsteady light through the open door, and the room smelled of wood smoke and milk and the quiet of a place that has known both grief and tenderness. "Come inside," Marguerite said at last. Her voice was low. She stepped back, and they entered, and the door closed softly behind them against the evening cold. There was a cradle beside the hearth, a plain wooden thing with a linen blanket folded over its edge. Marguerite moved to the chair nearest the fire and sat, and settled the child in the crook of her arm. She looked at Edward directly. "I will tell you everything," she said, "and I will tell it plainly." And she did. Her voice remained level throughout. A childhood companion, a young woman who had been like a sister to her, had come to Greyvale in secret, already dying of a fever that no physician could turn. The companion's name was Mary Rose. Her initials were M.R. She had agreed, of her own accord, to be buried in Marguerite's name, to be recorded in the parish register as the Countess of Greyvale, deceased in childbed. She had not been coerced. She had insisted. She had no family remaining, and she had told Marguerite that dying as herself or dying as a countess made very little difference to her soul, but that it might make a great difference to Marguerite's life. Her former betrothed was a man of considerable violence and considerable persistence, Marguerite continued. He had made plain that a marriage ceremony and a title would not alter his claim upon her. He was the sort of man who considered a woman a possession regardless of what the law recorded. She had believed, and she had not been wrong, that only her death would free her. And so she had died on paper, in the parish register, in the grief of a household that did not know they were mourning the wrong woman. She had come to the dower house with her infant daughter. She had lived there in careful silence with one trusted servant who had since passed away. She had told no one. She had watched the main house from her single window, and she had not stopped thinking about the cost of the choice she had made. When Marguerite finished speaking, the room was very quiet. The fire shifted and settled. The child slept on, its small breath perfectly even. Edward stood near the hearth with his hands at his sides. He had not interrupted her. When she was done, he looked at his daughter for a long time. The child's face was turned toward the warmth. One small hand had worked free of the blanket and lay open, the fingers loosely curled. Edward looked at that hand. "Why did you not come to me?" he asked at last. His voice was quiet. It held no accusation, only the plain weight of the question itself. Marguerite's eyes did not falter. "Because I was not certain you would choose me over the arrangement," she said. Edward said nothing immediately. Clara stood near the door and did not move. Then Edward spoke. "You should have been certain," he said. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something quieter, the truth of what he might have done given the chance, given the courage of an earlier moment. Marguerite looked at him for a long time. Outside, the birch trees stood pale and still in the dark, and the lamp in the single window of the dower house continued to burn. Edward stood very still on the garden path, the lantern held low, its light catching the frost at his boots. He did not speak at once. He was a man who had learned through long years of managing an earldom and all its silences to think before he gave voice to a difficulty. A woman lay buried in the churchyard under Marguerite's name. Her companion, her most faithful shadow, had consented to vanish so that Marguerite might vanish beside her. The law knew nothing of this. The parish register knew nothing. The stone bore the wrong name, and yet the carved dates were true enough, for the companion had died within a fortnight of the same fever that had made the deception possible. That much was tidy. What was not tidy was the child, Isabel. 3 months old and sleeping in the dower house, entirely ignorant of the geometry of her own existence. Her legitimacy rested on a single fact, that her mother was the Countess of Greyvale. If Marguerite was alive, she was still the Countess. If she remained the Countess, Isabel was legitimate. But Marguerite could not simply step back into the light. A woman who had permitted a burial under her name had committed an act the law might regard most unfavourably. Edward turned all of this in his mind the way one turns a stone, with more edges than expected. Then he looked at Clara. "What do you intend," he said, "to do with what you have seen tonight?" Clara did not look away. She was cold. She had been cold for an hour and had not mentioned it, because cold was a smaller matter than the one before them. "Nothing," she said. "Unless you ask me to do otherwise, I am neither your enemy, my lord, nor a fool." He studied her face in the lantern light. He was revising something she understood, some settled picture of her, as the quiet woman who moved through his household like a shadow. He set it aside and found another beneath it. When he had done so, he said, "Thank you," simply, without ornament, and it landed in the cold air with a weight she had not expected. She turned her face toward the house. There was Marguerite to think of, and the child, and the room that must be prepared. These were practical matters. Clara understood practical matters. She was grateful for them. They went back together and found Marguerite awake, sitting beside the cradle, her hair loose, her eyes entirely clear. She had not wept again. She had the composure of a woman who had done her weeping months earlier, and had arrived now at a flat and careful calm. Edward spoke quietly. There was a room in the east wing of the main house, small, warm, away from the corridors the household used by day. It had been aired under the fiction of a guest who had not arrived. It would now accommodate a recovery from illness instead. Marguerite was not dead. She had been gravely ill, too ill to be moved, these past months cared for by a trusted woman in the dower house. The household would understand this. A great house's loyalty was not merely a sentiment, it was a skill cultivated over generations. Servants knew how to know things without saying them. Clara lifted Isabel from the cradle with the practised ease of a woman who had attended many a confinement, settled the warm weight of her against one shoulder, and wrapped the blanket close. Isabel stirred, but did not wake. She was a peaceable infant, as though she had already decided the world did not require her alarm. They crossed the dark garden in a quiet procession, Edward carrying the lantern, Marguerite walking at his side, Clara with the child. The frost was heavier now. No wind disturbed the hedgerow. The house received them without comment. The east wing corridor held a single lamp and smelled of beeswax and cedar. The room was warm, a fire burning low, the bed turned down, a small cradle waiting beside it, with the quiet efficiency of servants who asked no unnecessary questions. Clara settled Isabel into it and straightened. Marguerite stood in the middle of the room as though she was not entirely certain it was real. Edward remained in the doorway. "Rest," he said. "We will speak in the morning." She nodded. She did not trust herself to more than that. Clara followed Edward into the corridor, and they walked together toward the garden door. At the threshold he paused and said, without looking at her, "You are very good at keeping secrets." Clara considered the words. "I am very good," she said, "at being overlooked." He turned and looked at her directly, and his expression was not what she had expected. It was not amusement. It was something more careful and more serious. "That," he said, "is not the same thing at all." The garden was dark beyond the door. The frost lay undisturbed on the path. Clara stepped out into the cold and did not reply, because she thought he was probably right, and she was not yet certain what to do with that. By morning, Greyvale Court had already learned to breathe differently. The servants moved with the quietness of a household that has agreed, without saying so aloud, upon a new arrangement of the truth. Word had been permitted to travel below stairs, and then beyond the gates, that the lady had not died at all, that the confinement had been complicated as some confinements were, and that the worst had been feared, but had not, in the end, arrived. The mourning clothes were put away, the black ribbon was taken from the knocker with no ceremony. It was the kind of revision that required everyone to hold their face very still, and so they did. By mid-morning the house looked from the lane like any other house where a child had lately been born and the mother was resting. Inside, the fiction settled around the rooms like dust after a disturbance, quietly, with a thoroughness that left very little to see. Marguerite kept to her chamber and ate warm broth. The infant daughter lay in a bassinet beside her, a small and serious creature with dark eyes that did not yet know what world they had entered. She had been given a name that morning, without announcement. The housekeeper had entered it into the household register in her neat hand. Clara. It was done as simply as that. Edward had said it quietly to Marguerite, and Marguerite, who was still very tired, had closed her eyes in something that was not quite agreement and not quite refusal. It was a kindness offered and received without either party needing to name what it was. Clara herself did not yet know. She was occupied with packing. Her single case sat open upon the bed, and she filled it with the same unhurried economy with which she did everything, folding her second dress with precision, wrapping her few small things in the manner of a woman who has learned to travel light without thinking it a hardship. She had been engaged as a temporary attendant for the laying out. The laying out had not taken place, but that altered nothing in the particulars of her engagement. Her work was finished. She buckled the case and carried it downstairs as she had come, quietly, drawing no attention to her departure, expecting none. She set the case at her feet in the entrance hall and drew on her gloves. She had arranged a seat on the afternoon coaching service. She was considering whether she had time for tea when she heard a step on the stair. Edward Ashvale descended without hurry. He was still in morning dress, without his coat, which was not how she had seen him before, and he stopped on the last step when he saw her. His eyes went to the case. He came down the remaining step, crossed the hall, and stood near enough that she would have had to make a visible effort to withdraw. He was quiet for a moment in the manner she had come to recognize. He did not speak until he knew what he intended to say. "Where are you going?" he said at last. "To the coaching inn, my lord," she said. "There is an afternoon service." He looked at the case again. "I have not offered you a position." Clara held her glove steady. "There is no position to offer," she said. "I am a temporary attendant. My work here is finished." He did not agree with her, and he did not contradict her. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before and could not quite name. It was not gratitude. She had seen his gratitude the evening before, and it had looked quite different. It was something slower than gratitude, something that had been arriving for some time without his noticing until this moment. "I am not speaking of a position," he said, very quietly. She looked at him directly, because she was not a woman who looked away when she needed to understand something. "Then, what are you speaking of, my lord?" He was silent for the length of several heartbeats. Then he said, "You are the only person in this house who has told me the truth in 3 months. Every other soul has managed me or shielded me or arranged things for my convenience, and never once considered whether I wish to be managed. I find I am not willing to watch you leave." The entrance hall was very still. Somewhere above them, the infant, Clara, slept in her bassinet beside her mother. The fire in the morning room had burned low. Outside, the lane was pale and empty, entirely indifferent to what passed within. Clara stood with her case at her feet, and understood, with great clarity, that she had not anticipated this. She had been very well prepared to depart unremarked. She was rather less prepared for this. She did not speak yet. She only held his gaze, and the holding of it was itself a kind of answer, though not the whole of one. The morning settled around them both, quiet and unhurried, as mornings will in houses where something has quietly shifted in the night. She did not answer him at once. That was the first thing Edward would remember. Not the words she said, but the pause before them. Clara set her travelling case down upon the stone floor, as though setting down something heavier still. She straightened. She looked at Greyvale Court, truly looked at it as a woman looks at a thing she is deciding whether to keep. The fires had been lit that morning in grates cold for months, and the smell of warm ash and beeswax moved through the corridors like a slow tide returning. Windows stood open that had been sealed. Light fell across flagstones in long pale rectangles, and the house breathed quietly, the way a creature breathes when it has at last been told the danger has passed. She thought of rooms in other houses that were never quite hers, of a pressed violet carried in her apron for reasons she had never examined too closely. Then she looked at Edward. "I shall stay," she said, "not because you have asked it, because I have chosen it." He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had been careful not to assume. Marguerite came through the hall not 10 minutes afterward, her daughter's hand tucked beneath her arm, both of them carrying the ease of women who have survived something difficult and emerged into an ordinary afternoon. She saw them, Edward near the window, Clara with her case still upon the floor, and understood in a glance what had occurred. She did not slow her step. She did not exclaim. Marguerite had always known that the most dignified response to another's happiness was to receive it quietly. She caught Clara's eye and gave her a small, composed nod, and in that nod was everything she might have said. It held gratitude for the months of silence. It held acknowledgment that Clara had protected her when she need not have done. It held the recognition that Clara Moss deserved to be standing exactly where she stood. Then Marguerite passed on into the morning room, and the hall settled back into its gentle quiet. That afternoon Edward took Clara into the walled garden, the one that grew the violets, spoken of in the household as the loveliest place on the estate. The walls were old brick, warmed by the afternoon sun, and the beds were coming back after a winter of neglect, small green shoots pressing through dark earth, with the unhurried conviction of things grown in the same soil for generations. They walked slowly. There was no need to fill the air. Edward spoke of the books he kept by him in winter, when the roads were too frozen to travel. Clara told him of the years spent in houses where the kindness was more uncertain than the heating, of what it had required to remain steady when the ground shifted. He listened as a man listens when storing a thing away carefully. She asked what he had found most difficult during the long, cold months. He considered the question. Not knowing, he said at last, whether the life I had made here was one that anyone would willingly share. She understood him precisely. They walked on, and the violet beds exhaled their faint, particular scent, and by the time they turned back toward the house they had begun, in the slow and earnest fashion of two careful people, the work of being truly known to one another. That evening, when the room she had been given was prepared and the fire laid, and the candle placed upon the dresser, Clara opened her apron and took out the pressed violet. It was dry and thin as paper now, the colour faded from deep purple to something closer to lavender, a little silver at the edges where light had reached it longest. She held it in her palm for a moment, then she set it on the window-sill, not beneath glass, not within any frame, simply placed upon the painted wood where the morning light would find it. It needed no protecting. It had already become what it was going to be. Edward came past the door the following morning and saw it there. The window had been opened and the early light fell directly across the sill, and the small dried flower looked in that pale beam very much at peace. He did not remark upon it. He went quietly downstairs. When Clara came down to breakfast a little later, she found on the window-sill beside the pressed violet a small bunch of fresh ones, newly cut from the walled garden, still carrying the cool of the early hour. He had placed them there without ceremony, without explanation, because they were wanted. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she sat down to breakfast and let the morning continue. It was, she thought, a very good beginning for a woman who had never expected to be seen and who would now, in this house, never be overlooked again. Outside, the walled garden lay quiet in the early light, and Greyvale Court settled into the unhurried life it had been waiting through all the long cold months to finally begin.